Estonia says 3 Russian fighter jets have entered its airspace without permission. Let's bring in our military analyst, Sean Bell. Sean, what more can you tell us? This follows, obviously, the situations we've seen with drones in Poland and also Romania. This time, a 12-minute incursion by 3 jets. What's going on?
Yeah, good afternoon, Gareth. I mean, the drones, because of the numbers, the distances involved, there was a potential that this was an error. As soon as you start talking about 3 MiG-21s, these are Foxhound supersonic fighter aircraft, a key part of the Russian Air Force inventory. They're incredibly capable. 12 minutes in Estonian airspace, they will have known that they were there. They will have known exactly what they were doing there. This was pre-planned. This was no mistake. And the challenge, of course, is that for NATO, well, Estonia initially, but then NATO, they were clearly identified. They were clearly were not engaged. And I think this will be a real test for the rules of engagement for NATO. But let's be quite clear, unlike the drone incursions earlier, this was premeditated. I operated in the Cold War in Germany. We had a buffer zone there. And believe you me, when you had gone even close to it, people were warning you. So going inside Estonian airspace for 12 minutes is no mistake.
I'm interested, just as we see this image of Putin flashing up our screen, and this is prior images, some library footage we're showing our viewers. Sean, how far up the chain of command does this have to go to allow Russian aircraft to violate sovereign national airspace, NATO-patrolled airspace as well? Would Putin have to have signed this off?
One of the things that's unique to autocracies is that they're paranoid about their own military turning against them. So they don't have, in the West, we have delegated responsibility. You operate with commander's intent. So even our corporals and sergeants can be leaders on the battlefield and make their own decisions. That is not the case in the Russian military. When something happens, everybody looks to their right, looks up at the next guy and says, "What do you want me to do, sir?" He looks right and does exactly the same thing. Something as serious as this, there is no doubt that President Putin would have had to sign this off. And it's clearly, I think, a test for NATO, because there's long been a discussion that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the Baltic states, formerly part of the Soviet Union, haven't got a great deal of military capability indigenous to them. In fact, Estonia, where this airspace was incurred, they don't have an active air force. I think they've got something like 2,000 personnel, a few unmanned aircraft and some radars. And that's one of the reasons why NATO does its Baltic air policing out of Almari Air Base in Estonia that patrols the skies over there to provide some deterrence value. But be under no illusions, this would have come from the top. It's a very clear test for NATO, because up till now, NATO seems reluctant to fight back. And when you have military aircraft of an air force that's currently involved in a war just a few miles down the road, this is very serious, and NATO will be looking very carefully at how it responds.
I'm just thinking of where this goes, Sean, because, at the end of the day, Russia's got massively bogged down in Ukraine, and the reality in any days, weeks, months, or maybe even in the short term, years' time, you can't see it legitimately entering and violating, the territorial ground of these nations. It can't muster enough forces to try and, do what it's done in Ukraine and Estonia anytime soon. So, is the purpose of this just to keep throwing the thorn in the side of NATO, to keep making Trump look like a fool, to keep trying to trip the grouping up? Because it doesn't serve any legitimate military purpose per se, does it? This is more just throwing stones and seeing where they land and kind of, jabbing the hornet's nest, it feels.
It might be, but I always think it's a bit dangerous if we assume that Putin is stupid, because very rarely does he do something that has no specific military intent. I think it's been, the West is having to look at, does it continue to help Ukraine as it has been, and gradually it might slow the pace of losing, but Ukraine is still losing, or has it got to look at new ways to help? And the no-fly zone is something that has been regularly talked about, particularly with the drone incursions in Romania and Poland. It's starting to gather a little head of steam. Now, if Putin was to demonstrate that the airspace over Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania was vulnerable, he might draw limited numbers of NATO assets to force a defence of that region, and therefore make it less likely that they would have the appetite or the resources to do a no-fly zone into Ukraine. Now, none of us know know. Clearly, it's only in the mind of President Putin, but I think there does follow a little bit of logic here that Putin's probably feeling worried that the West is getting slightly emboldened, and therefore just reminding it that actually up to the north, those former Baltic states are very vulnerable without NATO air support.